Good morning. We're going to talk today about a variety of different things. This is video number 4 in the series. And this week we're going to be talking a lot about intelligence tests and behavior checklists and a variety of things like that. So I'm going to get right to it and share my desktop and start talking about a number of things about the class. First off, I want to talk about the issue with regard to um, personal visits. They really help, I think, clarify things on a one-to-one basis. If you have any unique needs, then we can get things straightened out during those short visits. You don't need to do them; they're not required, but they are certainly things that might be able to help you a little bit if that's something you're interested in. Um, so that being the case, then please be aware that I am available for you at any point. All right, so um, let's go to the video and we'll get rocking and rolling. Week 4, cohort 043, an assessment. Okay, let's talk about intelligence testing first. As you probably are well aware, there are a number of different types of intelligence tests, but the most common that are used in the school setting or the WISC-5. For some of the younger students, we may be using the KABC. Some districts even use the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive. Seeing not so much of that, but it is used by some districts. And then for very low functioning kids, on occasion, when either the WISC-5, the KBC, or the WJ cognitive can't be used, there's the Stanford Binet. It used to be used a lot more frequently, but not so much anymore. Um, and then there are a number of nonverbal tests that measure ability as well. The TONY, which is the test of nonverbal intelligence in the unit, um, are two that are used quite often. And then with any intelligence testing, there are a number of informal things that you can do to prepare for those tests as well. And sometimes just observing how the student approaches tasks and organizes and plans activities will give you more information that you can include when a psychologist in particular writes up their part of the assessment regarding intelligence. Um, so, and there are two different questions down there. First off says, why do we do an intelligence test? Also known as an ability test. And the reason we do an intelligence test in the education assessment is we want to rule out that any difficulties that are being observed by a child are not the result of a cognitive deficit or basically just low ability. Um, Now, it's certainly possible that low ability and behavioral issues, as an example, can coexist. I mean, that's not out of the question. But if there are low ability issues, then how you approach the situation may make things a little more complicated, and you just need to take that into consideration. One of the other reasons that we do an intelligence test, especially on initial evaluations, is because of the fact that we want to rule out whether the underlying issue for the student is actually a learning disability. And as you may know, many kids who have severe learning disabilities end up with behavioral issues simply because they're frustrated and are having difficulty learning, and that's the way they manifest their anger and their frustration is through behavior. And sometimes when we have these types of kids, we can provide that level of support so that their ability or excuse me, so their academics improve. We can actually see an improvement in their behavior as well. So who does ability testing? And of course, the only individuals who are allowed to do the testing are school psychologists And then on occasion, there are outside assessments that are done by licensed psychologists. And in some states, they use individuals who are specifically trained to provide testing and ability testing, and those are known as psychometrists. So you might get a file from out of state where a psychologist did not do the testing, but a psychometrist that did. And that psychometrist then doesn't really have a master's degree in psychology, but they may have completed all the assessment courses in order to be able to be qualified to administer the ability test. So I'm going to use a whisk as my primary method of explanation, simply because the whisk is the probably the most common assessment tool used in ability. So let's talk about what is measured on a whisk. And a whisk, as you may know, it stands for Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And we're at the fifth edition right now. And if you go back for a number of years, you might actually see a fourth edition, but certainly nothing older than that. All right, so some of the areas that are measured in the WISC are verbal comprehension, and verbal comprehension basically is exactly what it sounds like. It's how they use and understand language. Here's the thing about verbal comprehension, and I often use this when I'm making an assessment on a child. Verbal comprehension is probably the score that is most highly correlated to academic success. And if you stop and think about it, it just makes sense because language is very, excuse me, learning is very language based, and as a result, if there's a good solid understanding of language, then the chance for success in academics is better. Where that might come into play as far as a learning disability is concerned is that if you got really strong verbal comprehension, but you're looking at some of the math scores and so forth, you might see some significant differences between ability and achievement. And so you'd start thinking that there's the possibility of a learning disability. Visual spatial on the WISC is done by looking at a number of different puzzle types of activities, um, block design, puzzles of a number of different sorts, and throughout the assessment it takes a look at that. Um, Fluid reasoning is a series of subtests that really measure how a student learns when they are presented with something brand new. So, in a fluid reasoning subtest, for example, you have to almost teach the skill before you can assess it. And very much so, what happens with you and your classroom when you're working with kids before you can have any knowledge of their ability to complete a task, you have to teach that task first. So fluid reasoning, the score for that really gives us kind of an idea of where a kid is um, standing when it comes to just learning new material. Now that in combination with the next area, working memory, gives us an idea of how that student learns even more deeply. Because if you give a student a newest tool or a new activity to learn, then of course what you do have to do at that point is assess how well they can apply that. And they may be able to apply it in the short term when you're giving them an activity to do, but can they remember how to do that after a period of time? And can they access it later in a different learning environment, pull that information to the front of their brain and apply it? So we're looking at, obviously, with working memory, both long-term memory and short-term memory. Um, so, and as you well know, you're working with kids, sometimes the short-term memory is just fine, and sometimes the long-term memory is better. It just depends on the kid. And if you think about how these two things apply to behavioral issues, Okay, so one of the things you might be doing is working with a kid in social or behavioral training. And if you introduce a topic, you need to figure out, are they going to be able to learn it for one thing and apply it in the short term? And if they learn it, can they recall that down the road? So if they're in the classroom and they're presented with a situation that's conflictual in some way or another, do they have the skill set that they can call on from memory in order to be able to deal with that? So taking a look at fluid reasoning and working memory does have a very direct effect on how you can approach behavioral tasks down the road, as does verbal comprehension. You stop and think about it, because if they're having language issues involved, you know, that understanding of language and what people mean when they give them directives, or being able to respond in an organized manner to a request, can be related back to verbal comprehension. Processing speed is another area that is how quickly a student works. And this is where we oftentimes see issues with impulsivity. And some students just want to get it done as fast as they can. And so as a result, they may end up botching up their scores in the area of processing speed because they were impulsive. But then again, you might also see a student who works slowly but accurately. And as we can make a determination as to how a student works best from a time perspective, then that helps us somewhat. Some kids, given a non-time situation, do just fine. But anytime you put a time limit on things, which is called a power test or a power situation, anytime you put a time limit on it, it has a negative effect on their ability to operate efficiently. So processing speed is important too when you're applying it to behavior as well, because you give a kid a request. Are you giving them enough time to be able to process that information verbally, and then are to be able to pull out from their memory what the appropriate response is and then act? So you can see how all of these five areas then can have a direct impact on the behavioral needs of a student. Okay. Um, Going on, the other big area that is measured, of course, is the full scale IQ. Uh, uh, just simply referred to oftentimes by the term IQ or ability score, and the mean or the average for the whisk is 100, and I think that's people pretty much get that 100 IQ is average, and then the standard deviation is 15. So the range from 85 to 115 is considered to be average. When you start to get below 85 to 70, you're talking in low average, and when you're getting closer to 70, it's becoming more problematic. And then below 70, you're starting to see some cognitive deficits. In the opposite direction, when you're up at around 115, 120, then you're starting to see kids who are operating in that high average range. And if you get up into high upper 120, 130, then you're talking about kids who are starting to display some characteristics that are quite strong in ability. And and sometimes we take a look at kids who have extremely high IQs, but their academic performance is not good. And some of the reason for that, of course, it has to do with a lot of those things we talked about, processing speed and to be honest with you, it could also have a lot to do with motivation and impulsivity and a variety of different things. So a kid with behavioral needs may have more of an issue with how they process the information rather than can they process it to begin with. So that's how we take a look at the WISC. We can take more detail and look at some of the other assessment tools as well, like the KABC and so forth. But as I said, the WISC is the most commonly used one, so that's why I chose to concentrate on that one. We have a number of behavior assessments that are typically used in EBD assessments, and the probably the most common is the BASC-3. The BASC stands for Behavior Assessment System for Children, third edition. And you will occasionally see some older versions of that test or that checklist out there. But right now, the most common one you see is the BASC-3. The Connors, the Achenbach, and the Vineland and the ABAS are their behavior assessment, but they're really more for adaptive behavior and functional skills, and not necessarily for the types of behavior issues that we're dealing with here. Going on, the let's talk a little bit about what each of these assessment tools are used for. The BASC-3 really is very specifically behavior oriented, and when we're taking a look at issues related to uh, externalizing versus internalizing behavioral conditions and so forth, we'll get into talking about those in a few minutes. The Connors is one that's often used for identifying students with ADHD, attention deficit, and Yakubak also is another one that can help us to identify issues with impulsivity and attention deficit as well. So let's take a look at the Connors 3. And the Connors is an assessment tool that takes a look at a variety of areas: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Obviously, those two areas are highly related to attention deficit. It also gives us an idea of learning problems. Executive functioning, which is having to do with organization and planning, and so forth. Learning problems plus executive functioning, in other words, how those two areas relate to one another and interact. Aggression, um, and aggression, defiance, and then peer relations. All of those areas, as you well know by this point in your career, are highly related to the ability of a child to learn behavioral competency. Now, the other major areas that are measured in the Connors are ADHD inattentive, ADHD hyperactive impulsive, conduct disorder, and oppositional defiant disorder. You're actually going to get some scores that will allow us to make a determination as to whether that particular student's ability is clinically significant, or if it's at risk, or if it's operating in the normally functioning range. Um, the Connors, as is the BASC and a variety of other tools that we use, are checklists. And they're distributed to teachers, they're distributed to the parents, and oftentimes, if a student is old enough, we can give that assessment tool to the student themselves as well. Okay. You probably hear my cat and dog in the background making noise. That's not unusual. All right, the BASC-3. The BASC-3 takes a look at a number of different areas, and these are really important to kind of take a look at when you're analyzing the results of the BASC. Obviously, your school psychologist is the one that's going to do the interpretation, but it's good for you to know what they're interpreting and how and why. The BASC takes a look at a variety of different areas. As I said earlier, it takes a look at externalizing behaviors and also internalizing behaviors. So the simplest way to look at that is to look at externalizing our behaviors that you see. Internalizing are behaviors that that child feels. So let's talk about the what is it that you can see behavior wise. Well, you certainly can see and observe hyperactivity. You can observe aggression, and you can observe and measure both conduct problems and aggression pretty easily as well. So as a result, those three things, when you look at a kid, you can actually say, oh yeah, I can see what's happening with that student. Now, you got to be a little bit careful with some of these things as well, because hyperactivity can manifest itself in a variety of different ways, such as inability to sit still, blurting out, and a variety of things like that, which might have some comorbidity with some other issues as well. And there certainly could be other reasons that a student is hyperactive. For example, they might be on medication that can cause some of those types of symptoms to appear. Used to be that oftentimes asthma medication was identified as causing some level of hyperactivity and impulsivity in kids. I think that as time has moved on, they've gotten better at diagnosing and prescribing the correct medication for a student, as well as titrating the medication to make sure that it's in the proper amount. Um, so, all right. The next area is the internalizing behaviors. What is it that child is feeling when it comes to behavioral concerns? And some of those areas that we talk about are anxiety, depression, and somatization. So anxiety, as you well know, it just can be manifested in a child looking like they're nervous. Again, that could relate back to what we not only what we're seeing what that child is feeling, but we might see the result of that anxiety and some of that impulsivity, and aggression and whatever conduct problems. It can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. What else could the child be feeling? They could be feeling depressed, and so depression becomes an issue that we want to keep an eye on and measure as well. And in a depressed state certainly can have a negative impact on behavioral concerns as well as academic ability. Uh, Somatization it refers to uh, the student who oftentimes wants to go to the nurse quite frequently, and maybe always feeling a little bit ill, and those kinds of things, and got the stomach ache, the headache, those kinds of things. So, you, as you well know, many kids it will manifest their behaviors in that way when they're not uh, interested, motivated, when they simply want to act out, they will take on those symptoms of physical problems and report them so they can get out of class and go to see the nurse. Um, Other areas that are covered in the BASC include school problems. You will get some indicator of whether there's some attention to task problems are learning problems. And so when you're taking a look at the scores that are generated by the BAS3, those are things to be aware of as well. And why is that included in a behavior assessment? And of course, as we had mentioned before, everything is related. So it's very possible that the student might have school problems, but they might be more a result of their inability to attend to tasks for longer periods of time. So we need to take that into consideration and also relate that back to what we talked about in the WISC. And if there's school problems, what specifically is going on? Are they having problems with understanding language? Are they having problems with learning new tasks and so forth? That's why you cannot take any one test in isolation. You have to have multiple uh, ways of looking at a kid so that you can draw conclusions across the spectrum. The other area here, the behavioral symptoms index is measured atypicality. What's different about this kid? What makes him unique behaviorally? And then withdrawal. Sometimes we see a kid's actually kind of um, draw inward and less likely to interact and so forth. Finally, the adaptive scales in the BASCs 3 are there as well. And the adaptability, social skills, leadership, study skills, and functional communication. As you can tell, these are more what kids do, they and how they get along, and so forth. And so when we're talking about adaptive scales, if we're seeing issues with that, it will lead us to making conclusions about how they interact socially and within a classroom as well. The functional communication, of course, is important to make sure that the student has the minimal ability to be able to function and understand language and to be able to respond in an appropriate way when given the opportunity. So how do we interpret the task? Okay, first off, it's measured across settings. You have to have multiple raters, and so it's best to have um, a classroom teacher, a specials teacher as an example, maybe even a para. You have parents, the special ed teacher. You want a number of at least three assessments completed, checklists rather, completed by various people, including the parents and oftentimes the student themselves, if you feel like they have the ability to respond in that way. So across settings, because you want to see that the behaviors are pervasive or not, and also by multiple raters because you want to make sure that there's no bias involved. For example, oftentimes we will do a checklist and teachers see things as being just more or less average or at risk, but the parents are fed up with the kid and their scores go off the chart when it comes to the BASC. And sometimes it's the opposite too. The scores in school are off the charts, but at home the parents are not seeing problems or they're not willing to identify those. So the three things that we can categorize a score in a BASC are of clinical significance. In other words, this is the area where we're making a determination that that child very definitely has characteristics that look like a behavioral disability. Um, in the BASC, as you can see down at the bottom, is measured by T-scores, and if you get a score that's at the 70 plus range, that would be a clinical significance. Um, and there are charts that are generated by most of the software that measures the BAS that will identify that break line as to whether a behavior is clinically significant or not. And keep in mind that if you make that determination, it is better if you're going to put a kid into or identify a kid with a behavioral disability. You want to make sure that at least two or three of your raters have that child up in the clinically significant range, and it's even more solid when everybody's in agreement. We probably over-identify slightly when it comes to um, with kids because we will oftentimes take a look at-risk scores and say, all right, mom and one teacher put this child at the clinically significant range, but the special teachers only puts them at the at risk range. But we're going to say, well, maybe it's because that student in that particular setting and gym or in art or is that at a little less confrontational, and so their behavior looks better in those areas. And that is scores between 60 and 70 are the ones that end up being at risk, and anything below 60 would be considered in the normal range as far as the BASC is concerned. But understand that the scores for the BASC, for the Connors, for the brief, um, ASRS, a number of different assessment tools are measured in T-scores and not in standard scores like the ability scores or the achievement scores like the Woodcock-Johnson 4. Those are all standard scores with a mean of 100. And so you you have to understand that there is a difference in the way that things are measured and how they're reported. So the functional behavior assessments, what we have with regard to that um, are a number of different approaches. The one that I use is something called the FBA Profiler. It's an online tool that I found really effective, and I like it because it gives us some relatively easy to use results, and it also provides a section for mental health screening as well. So the mental health, the FBA profiler is a norm reference and criterion reference behavior rating scale designed to identify problem or target behaviors, suggested hypothesized functions of the behavior, and provide a screening of possible mental health issues. So those are the three areas that we take a look at. What are the target behaviors? What are the functions of that behavior? And then how does that have an impact on the mental health concerns of that child? So behavioral concerns which are noted to be at risk are those that fall just outside of the average or normal range and represent moderate or emerging behavioral difficulties, and behavioral concerns which are rated as clinically significant are those that fall significantly beyond the average or normal range and represent behaviors which are severely discrepant from the general population. So I'm going to back out of this for a second, and I am going to show you the uh, the functional behavior profiler. Okay, so this is um, there is a free version of this, but I own this, and so it works just fine. I don't own it. I have a license for it. Um, And then there are a number of different things. So the one that we're using here is the FEA Pro. And what I'm going to do is go here. And so what we end up with here is a checklist, as we had mentioned before. And uh, I'm going to show you what these forms look like. And so this is a form that you can actually send to a parent and to the teachers. You can print this out and have them complete it. And you'll see that it's a checklist. I believe it's 120 questions. Um, and they respond simply by circling the 1, 2, or 3. Make sure, of course, that they put in the demographic information up here as well. And it's fairly extensive. I'm not going to read through all these, but you can see that it's pretty extensive in the areas that it takes a look at it and that it measures. You got three possible answers. Number one is not true, and number two is somewhat true, and number three is very true. Okay, you'll notice that this is the form for the parent or the teacher rating, and then if you click on this, you'll see that there's a student rating as well. It changes it to the first area. So like it's a first person rather. I don't pay attention to the details. I'm fidgety or squirmy, those kinds of things. And the nice thing also for those of you that need a Spanish form, they're actually in Spanish as well. Um, so that's good. Now let's go back to the opening layout, and I'm just going to pull up a a record that I have here on a student. I'm just going to pull one up and view the report, and I'm going to get rid of the signal. All right, so you see this one was only completed by two different teachers, but let's take a look over here. And what are we looking at here in the areas? Total internalized, total externalized, off-task avoidance, social withdrawal, passive aggression, somatic issues, disruption, delinquency, active aggression, and defiance. So, and you can see that it did a validity check, okay? And again, please understand that this is only for demonstration purposes, but let's take a look at what these scores show us. You look at this particular teacher found nothing in the at-risk or the clinically significant range. The classroom teacher, however, he found two areas in the at-risk range, and then one in the clinically significant, and that's in off-task and avoidance. And then another two areas over here were in the at-risk range, and that's in disruption and delinquency. So you can see that this particular kid, when they did the checklist in this one, um, did not really show characteristics that would be enough to place that kid in an initial assessment. In this particular case, though, this was a reevaluation, and so what we were looking for is what are the tendencies, and does the reevaluation then continue to support placement for that child? Is it necessary for that child to continue to receive services? All right. Um, so the other area too, let's go back to that one more time uh, and look at the report on that one again. And you'll notice that going down, now we have the written report on this one. And you see that again, what are the target behaviors that we're looking at for this child? um, Task avoidance, disruption, delinquency. Those are three areas. And it could certainly be a number of different areas that pop up as target behaviors. Those are just three that happen to show up for this particular child. And if you go down, what's the function of those behaviors? Why is that child engaging in those activities? In this particular case, we're looking at attention seeking, social status, self indulgence, and so it kind of, and what it will report then is attention seeking. They're clinically significant, one teacher at risk, the other teacher. And that way it says that his behavior might allow him to gain attention from others, and typical behaviors may include teasing, complaining, interrupting, or otherwise disrupting those around him. Common behavioral triggers include feeling ignored, negative peer influence or encouragement, or feeling unprepared or inadequate. And then the nice part is it gives some suggested interventions. Now, think about this a second. If it gives us interventions, then that means that if we zero in on one of these areas and drill down, you may get enough information then to actually develop some goals and objectives based on the functions of the behaviors and the interventions that you want to apply. And many of the kids have much more detail in the results. I just pulled this one up at random so you can see it. And then it gives us a mental health screening, and it talks about some of the issues that might be related to mental health concerns. And in this particular kid's case, it talked about ADHD inattentive, ADHD hyperactive, and then the possible presence of ODD, oppositional defiance disorder. Now, you can print this report and put it in your file. What I typically do is just copy paste this entire thing and just drop it into Sped forms, and it works really well. Um, and you know, if your psychologist is not aware of the functional behavior profiling, it might be worth mentioning it to them. They might not think it's extensive enough, but I think it does a nice job and puts things in language that that parents and teachers can understand. That's why I like it quite a bit. So that's the functional behavior profiling. Um, Go back to presenting again and go on. So, as I said, the target behaviors are specific and observable areas of behavioral concern, which can be identified for possible intervention. And based upon all available ratings, the following at-risk or clinically significant target behaviors uh, are suggested or can be found. And here's some of the areas. Remember, internalizing means that what they're feeling. Externalizing is what we're seeing. That's broadly speaking. And then there's the other areas: task avoidance, off-task behavior, social withdrawal, passive aggression, somatic issues. Again, how those how it manifests itself in headaches, stomach aches, and so forth. Disruption, delinquency, active aggression, and defiance. Those are all areas that can be measured not only with the functional behavior profiler, but in any FBA that you might undertake. So those are areas that you want to take a look at. All right, that targets behaviors, but why is the child engaged in those behaviors? That's the function of the behavior. And we can only guess, but we can make some fairly educated guesses as to why a student's engaged in certain activities. And some of those might be, and they're predictable, and some of those things might be for attention seeking, social status, escape avoidance. You don't want to, I don't want to be doing math right now, so I'm going to get into a behavior so I can get kicked out. Self-indulgence, defensive reaction, and power and control is one that we see quite often, particularly in middle school and high school kids. All right. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the nice part of the FBA profiler is that you get recommendations for intervention in the mental health screening. So I really like the FBA profiler, but as I said, some psychologists might think it's not quite as extensive as they need. Uh, Whatever your team feels generates the results that you need to be able to make a quality decision on placement. But from my perspective, if you really want to, you could certainly do the more extensive FBA on perhaps an initial, but the FBA profiler, I think, certainly can be something that can be used to go back and on reevals and make that determination as to whether there's a continuing need. All right. So the other area that we often associate with the behavioral assessment piece is observations, and I like to talk to them in terms of systematic observations versus anecdotal. Systematic observations are ones that are measurable and are you're basically taking a look at the student on a comparative basis. Anecdotal means you're just going in and you're just observing what's going on in the room and taking note of what's going on around the child and how that child interacts with the the stimuli in the room, whatever that might be, how they're interacting with other kids, with the teachers, delivery of the material and so forth. Those are more anecdotal pieces of information that you can use. Both systematic and anecdotal information obtained from observations, though, are highly useful and become necessary when you're taking a look at what's going on with the kid from a purely behavioral standpoint. Uh, Observations need to be done in multiple settings, and particularly with initial evaluations, you need to take a look at three observations, and they should be done in different areas. Areas. So you certainly want one done in the regular classroom. You can have one done in the playground during specials classes, maybe in the lunchroom, on the bus. Okay, whatever the case may be. It just needs to be in a different setting. And you need to have three on an initial. And actually, on a reevaluation, they're not as necessary, but they still provide you with quality information that you can use to make that determination as to whether um, a, um, a concern is a continuing need or not. Um, the interval observations that you often see used are the ones that have the little boxes, and you go in and you identify a target behavior such as on task, off task, and it's divided into 15 or 30-second sections, and you observe as to whether the child displays the on task or off task during that interval, and then you switch over to the same sex peers during the second half of that interval, and you make the determination as to whether the same-sex peer is on task, and that is alternating same-sex peers. So in other words, you're going to compare that child, that boy, for example, to every other boy in the classroom to see if his behavior is equivalent to what's going on to others, or if it's clinically or significantly different. Um, so you might do this interval observation, and you find that your target student is off task um, 35% of the time, and then you do the same sex peers in the room, and they're off task, 5% of the time. Then you're going to say, yep, that's a significant difference. But oftentimes, what we find is that um, the the target student behavior on on task off task behavior is not significantly different than his peers in the room. And that tells you something. It tells you a variety of things. It tells you that either A, the student themselves is not really displaying that characteristic, or maybe it's an issue with how that teacher is delivering the information, how that teacher is teaching, and it might have an impact on you making a determination: is there good classroom management going on? Um, Next thing, what can affect observation data? Uh, the certainly the environmental concerns are issues that might have an effect on that. Light, as it says below there, lighting, temperature, are there windows in the room? Is it a large class? Are there a number of kids, or is it a small number of kids? Are there other behaviorally challenged kids in the room? Um, just is your presence as the rater in the room having an impact on the observation data that you receive? Is there are we is it Halloween, or is it Valentine's Day? Is it something that generally tends to agitate kids to begin with? Um, those are all important information. The other thing you want to do is, once you have your data collected for that session, you need to go up to the classroom teacher or whoever's observing the kids and say, was that typical behavior for this child for that day? And if the classroom teacher says no, then that, even though that might invalidate your data, it still tells you something. And you just need to make a determination of what that means to you. But if they say yes, that's pretty typical, then that gives you an idea of the validity of your assessment data or your observation data. Anecdotal data should reflect what is being taught, the organization of the classroom, as I said, classroom management, class rules, are the classroom visible to the kids, are outcomes posted? Those are all things that you can make a determination as to whether that it is a good learning environment for that child. While some rooms might have a lot of visual stimuli in the room, for some kids, that's okay, but for some others, it's not. It's such a distraction that is not a good deal. Stations, for example, if a classroom is using stations, they're moving the kids after 15-minute intervals. How does that affect that particular kid's behavior? Some kids are good at transitions, and some are not. And some kids can sit down and adapt to a slightly different learning environment in a relatively short period of time. And other kids might take the whole 15 minutes just to get in the right frame of mind to learn. And so the stations become pretty ineffective. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right. So now I'm going to wrap up by just talking a little bit about the case study, because we're getting close to that being due. Okay, I'd like to have you to have the case study completed by this weekend if you can. Again, if you need more time, just communicate that need to me. I don't have a problem with extending that. Um, Really, in my my deal, since this case study, the ESR and the IEP are all highly related, it really does not matter to me as long as I receive these, prior to the beginning of or to the end of class. Uh, Plus the fact that we have a smaller group, it makes it a little easier on me as far as assessing your skills. Um, so if you have not set up a one-to-one yet, to talk about how to approach the case study, that's okay. But I think for those of you that did take the time to visit with me, I think you found that it was useful. Um, and plus, I get to know you, and you get to know me a little bit. And I think that that's a good thing. It's a 20-minute max thing, and then you're done. And then you have a more clear idea of what you're doing and how you're approaching that task. Now, if you see grades that I have that you on things that you've done to have it been posted, you need to let me know. And as I said here, uh, the new Blackboard, particularly on these asynchronous classes, is pretty confusing. And sometimes people post to a reply to something, and I was expecting it to show up in another area, and as a result, then I miss it and forget to give you the points for it. I haven't found anything that is terribly problematic at this point if I haven't contacted you. But please let me know if you see something that I missed. The reality of this class is if you do the case study, ER, and IEP, you're going to get a good grade out of the class. It's really not problematic. It's almost like a checklist of activities. Follow the samples that are given to you, and you shouldn't have any problems. As far as the reporting of the IEP and the ER, you certainly can use Sped forms or whatever that format if it's easier for you. That's perfectly fine. As far as the case study is concerned, use the format that's in the course materials, and I think you'll be fine with that. But at any point, if you're running into problems, you just need to let me know, and we can get together either with a quick video conference or email, text, whatever the case may be. All right. So the other part is and I mentioned this earlier, and that is